Welcome back, guys. We're going to look at our question of the day. The question that has come through is a fairly simple one, and it is, why did God want to kill Moses? Now, this is a kind of relatively unheard of story. It's not one of the major stories that you find in the whole story of Moses, Exodus, and so forth. It only takes up 3 verses. And what we've got to be very, very careful of in this case is to not step outside of what the Bible says. So the Bible has little to say on it, and we need to run with the facts that the Bible gives to us. Okay, so in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 24, you find the story. The Bible says, on the way to Egypt, at a place where Moses and his family had stopped for the night, the Lord confronted him and was about to kill him. Continues on, but Moses' wife Zipporah took a flint knife and circumcised her son. She touched his feet with the foreskin and said, now you are a bridegroom of blood for blood to me. When she said bridegroom of blood, she was referring to the circumcision. After that, the Lord left him alone. And that's all that the Bible says. Okay, so the question that sort of comes up initially is, well, why hadn't Moses circumcised his son? Well, we need to remember that Moses did not get married in Israel or in Egypt. He got married. He did not even get married within his culture. He married an Ethiopian girl who was living in Midian, and as such, he had become a part of the tribe. For the last 40 years, he'd been a part of the tribe of Midian, not the tribe of Israel. And, the circumcision was something that had been given to Israel. It had not been given to the Midianites. As such, it was probably something that they saw as being abhorrent. It may have been something where they would have been, social pressure not to circumcise. And we understand how social pressure works in relationship to circumcision these days. Can create a lot of debate on that subject in a very short space of time. And so there's probably a whole bunch of reasons as to why Moses had neglected to do this. However, God had given circumcision to Abraham. It was something that was to be passed down. And what this story illustrates for us is that God is specific about the things that he asks. God doesn't just say, hey, here's a great idea. Why don't you go and circumcise everybody? All of the men, that is. He says, no, this is something that is for everyone, and he expects it to be for everyone. Sometimes we think that God speaks in generalities and that God is not specific. No, God is always specific about what he says, even with things as simple as a day on which we worship. And so moving on from here, we find that Moses has been called by God reticently to go back and to lead Israel into freedom. And he is on his way to do so because he has accepted that calling. Now, in accepting that calling, he is leaving the Midianite tribe, the tribe of Midian, and he's going to reattach himself to the Israelite tribe. He's going to go back to being an Israelite, but as such, he has not performed circumcision on his son. Therefore, his son can never be a part of the tribe of Israel. And so this being something that would be distasteful for him and distasteful for his son is the kind of thing that, I think any reasonable guy would avoid doing so. And he's kind of avoided it. It's kind of like, well, we've been fine up until this point. Why would this be an issue? But God comes to Moses, and the issue is this. How are you going to call these people back to the service of God? How are you going to call them out of Egyptian idolatry? How are you going to call them back to the practice of circumcision, which is a part of serving God for God's people at that time? How are you going to call them back to all of that if you are not prepared to do it yourself? How are you going to call others to be obedient when you are not prepared to obey what God says? And this is why God confronts Moses at this particular point. It's interesting that Zipporah steps in, and Zipporah is the one, his wife, who actually performs the circumcision and saves Moses' life in that respect at that particular time. An interesting story, one that illustrates that God is specific when he asks us to do things.